police officer with a prejudiced gaze pulled over a black woman on a quiet Houston night. With a cold tone and the authority of the badge on his chest, he attempted to use his power to intimidate her. What he didn't realize, however, was that the woman behind the wheel was no ordinary citizen. She was Clarice Johnson, the Director of Internal Affairs, a woman who could, with one decision, determine the fate of his career. This story is a tense confrontation between prejudice and justice, a moment that lays bare the truth about the abuse of power still present in the system. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and meaningful stories. The red traffic light blinked on the main road leading to the suburban west side of Houston. Clarice Johnson, a woman in her early 40s, was driving her sleek black sedan down the deserted street. It was a typical evening after work. She had just wrapped up a long day filled with tense meetings at the Internal Affairs office. Clarice was no ordinary woman. As one of the few black women in a senior leadership position within the Houston Police Department, she was a symbol of perseverance, intelligence, and leadership. Yet, in her role, she often faced prejudice and skeptical glances, even from those she supervised. As her car glided down the tranquil street, the flashing lights of a patrol car suddenly illuminated her rearview mirror. The piercing sound of a siren broke the stillness of the night. Clarice frowned but maintained her composure. She pulled her car over to the side, turned off the engine, and waited. Stepping out of the patrol car was Officer Kevin Ramsey, a tall man with a cold, scrutinizing gaze. His eyes lingered on Clarice's polished vehicle before sweeping over her with an expression of suspicion and judgment. "License and registration, please," Kevin demanded in a curt, unfriendly tone. Clarice didn't reply immediately. She calmly opened the glove compartment, retrieving her documents with deliberate care. When she handed them to him, her gaze remained steady. "Officer, may I ask why I was pulled over?" she inquired, her voice measured and composed. Kevin flipped through her documents without haste. "You ran a yellow light," he stated, his eyes still assessing her. "That could have been dangerous." Clarice responded calmly. "Officer, I came to a complete stop before the light turned red. I don't believe I committed any violation." Kevin snorted, his gaze filled with doubt. He seemed dissatisfied with her explanation. "You're not from around here, are you? This address is from another area," he continued, his tone carrying an implicit accusation. Clarice recognized that look, the prejudiced scrutiny she had encountered countless times in her life, but she kept her emotions in check. "Officer, I'm on my way home. My address is clearly stated on my license," she replied, her tone firming slightly. Kevin straightened up, his face betraying a mix of defiance and suspicion. "What do you do to afford a car like this?" His question sounded more like an accusation than genuine curiosity. Clarice pressed her lips together, suppressing a sigh. This was no longer a routine traffic stop. This had turned into a power game, and she knew that any reaction deemed inappropriate could escalate the situation. "Officer, I don't believe my job is relevant to this situation," she said, her gaze steady but sharp. "I've provided all the required documentation. If there's nothing else, I'd like to continue on my way." Kevin, however, seemed unwilling to let the matter rest. Crossing his arms, he kept his eyes fixed on Clarice as if waiting for her to make a misstep. "Don't you think I have the right to know more about the person I'm dealing with?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Clarice knew she needed to remain patient. "I believe I've fully complied with your requests, officer," she responded. "And if you have any doubts, you're welcome to verify the information on my license." Kevin shrugged, clearly dissatisfied. He returned to his patrol car, feigning further examination of her documents. Meanwhile, Clarice sat quietly in her car, her gaze fixed on the night outside her window. The streetlights continued to cast their glow, but the atmosphere had grown heavier than ever. Clarice stayed still, her eyes focused outward, but her mind meticulously analyzing every aspect of the situation. She had witnessed behaviors like this before, power being misused under the guise of law enforcement. This time, however, she wasn't just an observer. She was directly experiencing it. Kevin emerged from his patrol car again, this time with a small flashlight in hand. He approached her vehicle, the beam of light dancing across her windshield. "Step out of the car, please," he instructed, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Clarice arched a brow, her expression composed, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. "Officer, I've complied with all your requests. Could you explain why you need me to step out of the car?" Kevin leaned closer, his hands bracing against her window. "You're questioning a police officer's authority, aren't you? Let me remind you that I'm the one in charge here." Clarice sighed softly, knowing she needed to tread carefully. She unfastened her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped out, her movements exuding control and poise. The sound of her high heels clicking against the pavement resonated in the still night, a sound both commanding and calm. Kevin took a step back, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. The tailored suit, her straight posture, and the confidence radiating from her demeanor seemed to unsettle him. "Place your hands on the hood of the car," he ordered, his voice stern. Clarice complied without protest, her gaze steady on Kevin. "What exactly are you suspecting me of, officer?" she asked, her tone unwavering. Kevin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he began to search her car slowly, as if trying to find a reason to justify his actions. Clarice stood still, clearly perceiving the helplessness in his demeanor. This was no longer about a minor traffic violation. This was an interrogation of her identity, of her race. When Kevin finished his search, he turned back to face her, his expression betraying his frustration. "There's nothing out of the ordinary," he said, as if the result annoyed him more than it relieved him. Clarice straightened her posture and adjusted her suit. "I have fully cooperated, officer. Now can you tell me the real reason behind all of this?" she asked, her tone carrying a sharpness she had previously tried to restrain. Kevin hesitated, his gaze flickering for a moment before responding. "You seem very familiar with legal procedures. What do you do for a living?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Clarice gave a faint smile. "I work in a field where transparency and accountability are paramount," she replied, her words laden with implication. Kevin frowned, clearly dissatisfied with her vague response. "I'll need to look into this further. Please wait here," he said, walking back to his patrol car. Clarice watched him leave, her sharp eyes never leaving his overly confident stride. In the brief moments while Kevin checked her information, Clarice stood still, contemplating her next move. She knew that revealing her identity at this point could completely change the dynamics of the situation. Yet she also understood that this was not just about her. This was about every black person, every woman, and every individual who faced discrimination daily without a voice. When Kevin returned, his demeanor was slightly altered. He extended her documents back to her. "I'll let you off with a warning this time. Be more careful," he said, his tone still cold. Clarice took the documents, but instead of getting into her car right away, she stood facing Kevin. "Officer Ramsey," she began, her voice clear and firm. "I think you should know that I am Clarice Johnson, Director of Internal Affairs for the Houston Police Department." Kevin froze in place. His face shifted from surprise to confusion and quickly to visible concern. Clarice continued, not giving him a chance to interrupt. "My job is to oversee the conduct of officers like you, ensuring that power is exercised properly and not abused. I won't be filing a report about this incident immediately, but I hope you take this encounter as a learning moment." Kevin stammered something incomprehensible, but Clarice didn't wait to hear it. She stepped into her car, closed the door, and drove away, leaving Kevin standing there, his face filled with uncertainty. On her way home, Clarice turned on the radio. This time, the familiar jazz tunes couldn't calm her mind. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a long battle. a battle against prejudice, abuse of power, and injustice, issues that had been deeply entrenched in the system for far too long. Clarice Johnson returned home with a heavy heart. Despite having endured countless uncomfortable situations in her career, each encounter reminded her of the profound injustice and prejudice that still pervaded the system she was striving to improve. Entering her cozy suburban home in West Houston, she was greeted by the warm glow of the lights and the cheerful laughter of her two young children. "Mom's home!" Sarah, Clarice's 10-year-old daughter, ran to hug her. Following closely was her 7-year-old brother Marcus, with a mischievous grin. Clarice bent down to embrace them, feeling a brief moment of peace wash over her. Sitting at the dinner table, Clarice tried to push aside the heavy thoughts clouding her mind to enjoy the meal with her family. But even as she listened to her husband, Nathan, recount his day at work, the image of Officer Kevin Ramsey lingered in her thoughts. His treatment of her wasn't just a personal issue, it reflected a systemic problem she had seen time and again in her work. The abuse of power and unconscious bias of those entrusted to protect the community. "Clarice, are you okay?" Nathan asked, his eyes full of concern. He knew his wife often kept silent when something was troubling her. Clarice offered a faint smile, trying to reassure him. "I'm fine," she said. "Just a few things happened today that I need to handle." After dinner, once the children were in bed, Clarice sat at her desk, her laptop open in front of her. She pulled up a file related to complaints and misconduct by officers in the area. Searching for Kevin Ramsey, she wasn't surprised to see his record flagged with a few warning signs. The screen displayed notes from previous reports: hostility toward individuals from minority groups, abuse of authority in traffic stops, and several unresolved complaints. Clarice knew this was part of a larger issue, not just about Kevin but about the entire oversight and management system for officers. She spent the rest of the night poring over the reports, jotting down key points. Clarice was determined to bring the matter to light, not as an act of personal retribution, but to ensure that such behavior would not continue unchecked. For her, this wasn't just a professional duty but a responsibility to the community she served. 2 days later, Clarice walked into the large conference room at the Houston Police Department. The room was filled with senior officers, each wearing a serious expression as they looked at the stack of documents Clarice brought with her. At the head of the table sat Police Chief Edward Collins, a composed middle-aged man with sharp, discerning eyes. "Clarice, I've heard about the recent incident," Collins began, his voice deep and authoritative. "I trust you have a good reason for calling this meeting." Clarice nodded, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Sir, I'm here to report on an incident that happened to me, but more importantly, to address a deeper systemic issue within our department." She placed the stack of documents on the table and began her presentation. Clarice recounted the incident with Officer Kevin Ramsey in full detail, describing everything from his demand for her to exit her vehicle without reasonable cause to his sarcastic attitude and prejudiced gaze. Her tone was not accusatory. Instead, she focused on how the situation reflected broader cultural and managerial issues within the system. "I've reviewed Officer Ramsey's record," Clarice continued, pointing to the documents on the table. "This is not the first time complaints have been filed about his behavior. However, most of these complaints were either ignored or inadequately addressed. This raises the question, are we truly monitoring and ensuring that our officers uphold professional ethics?" Collins stared at the documents in front of him, his brows slightly furrowed. "Clarice, you know we don't always have the resources to investigate every complaint," he said. "But I admit that what you've presented is very serious." Another senior officer, Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, spoke up. "Clarice, I understand your good intentions, but do you realize that digging into this issue could harm the reputation of the police department? We need unity, not division." Clarice turned to face Reynolds, her sharp gaze unwavering, yet calm. "Lieutenant Reynolds, unity only has value when it is built on integrity. If our reputation relies on covering up wrongdoing, then it is not a reputation worth protecting. The room fell silent. Collins, after a moment of contemplation, leaned back in his chair and sighed. Clarice, what do you propose? I propose a comprehensive investigation into Officer Kevin Ramsey's conduct, as well as other officers with similar records, Clarice replied, her voice resolute. Additionally, we need to improve our internal oversight systems to ensure that abuse of power is no longer tolerated. Collins scanned the room, his eyes stopping on each face. I agree that something must be done, he said, his tone grave but firm. Clarice, I'm assigning you the responsibility of overseeing this investigation. But be aware, you'll face significant pressure from both inside and outside the department. Clarice nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I understand, sir, and I am ready to face those challenges. As she left the meeting room, Clarice knew this was only the first step in a long and arduous journey, yet she also knew she had already begun to effect change, not just within the system she served, but also in how the community viewed justice and power. Clarice Johnson commenced the investigation quietly but resolutely, delving step by step into the depths of the system she had dedicated her career to improving. The initial documents analyzed by her team revealed startling details. Officer Kevin Ramsey's record was not an isolated case, but part of a larger issue where misconduct had been overlooked or inadequately addressed for years. Clarice wasn't surprised, but the weight of her responsibility was unmistakable. She understood that every action she took would be closely scrutinized by both her colleagues and the public. The early days of the investigation were marked by tension. Clarice faced considerable resistance from some colleagues, especially senior officers. Their disapproval ranged from subtle displays of attitude to outright criticism during meetings. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, a veteran officer, didn't hesitate to openly question her, arguing that her actions were damaging the department's morale. Clarice listened to these critiques with composure but remained unwavering. She responded with clarity and confidence, asserting that unity could not be built on the concealment of mistakes. She emphasized that if the police force wanted to regain the community's trust, they had to start by addressing their internal issues. The pressure came not only from within the organization, but also from the community. Some human rights groups expressed skepticism, suspecting that Clarice's investigation was merely symbolic and wouldn't lead to real change. Meanwhile, conservative organizations accused her of tarnishing the police department's image. Clarice recognized that she was caught between opposing forces, and this only strengthened her resolve. She believed that this effort wasn't just about correcting one individual's behavior, but about fixing a system riddled with long-standing flaws. The investigation also brought Clarice closer to the community she served. One morning, she received a call from Marjorie Williams, an elderly woman with a trembling yet determined voice. Marjorie shared that her son, Jamal, had been stopped and searched without cause by an officer, an incident that left a lasting scar on her family's life. Clarice met Marjorie at a small cafe to hear her story. As Marjorie spoke, her eyes welled with tears, but her voice remained steadfast. Clarice listened intently, taking detailed notes, and assured Marjorie that her story and others like it would not be forgotten. Stories like Marjorie's became a driving force for Clarice in the days that followed. She and her team tirelessly reviewed records, analyzed complaints, and interviewed witnesses. Their work not only exposed individual misconduct, but also highlighted systemic failures in internal oversight. One late night after the office had emptied, Clarice sat alone at her desk, reading and rereading reports, grappling with the complexity of the problem. She understood that this required more than procedural changes. It demanded a shift in the mindset of the entire system. The community began paying closer attention to the investigation as initial findings were made public. Clarice attended a community forum to discuss the progress and objectives of her work. The hall was packed with people, their faces a mix of hope and skepticism. A young man stood up and asked whether her efforts would truly lead to change, or if they were merely symbolic gestures. With her characteristic calm demeanor, Clarice responded that while she couldn't change everything overnight, she was committed to laying the foundation for a more equitable system. Her words were met with applause from most attendees, though she knew skepticism lingered and could only be dispelled through tangible action. In a subsequent meeting with Police Chief Edward Collins, Clarice presented the preliminary findings of the investigation. She emphasized that the misconduct was not limited to a few individuals, but reflected systemic issues. Chief Collins, a veteran with over 3 decades in the field, sighed as he listened to Clarice's report. He knew she was right, but also understood the significant challenges that implementing these changes would entail. Nevertheless, he agreed to her proposals to improve training and oversight systems and pledged his support for the next steps. Returning to her office after the meeting, Clarice felt a sense of relief mixed with determination. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles. Taking time to speak with her team, she expressed her gratitude for their dedication and shared her hopes for the future. Her passion inspired the team, reinvigorating their commitment to the work at hand. That night, back home, Clarice sat by the window gazing at the night sky. The glow of streetlights reflected on the window pane, creating shimmering patterns. She thought about the stories she had heard, the people she had met, and the change she was striving to bring about. A blend of determination and anxiety filled her heart. But above all, she knew she was on the right path, not just for herself, but for the community she had sworn to protect. Early one morning, as the sun began to rise, Clarice Johnson sat at her desk in the office. A steaming cup of coffee sat beside her, but her mind was far from its familiar aroma. On the desk lay a thick folder, the result of weeks of relentless work by her and her team. These pages contained evidence, testimonies, and detailed analyses of a system riddled with loopholes, allowing abuses of power to go unchecked. It was the product of perseverance, determination, and a steadfast belief that justice must prevail no matter the difficulty. Clarice had prepared everything for the critical meeting with Chief Collins and senior police leadership. This wasn't just a presentation of investigative findings. It was a turning point to determine whether her proposed changes would be accepted. The decisions made that day would not only affect her career, but also shape how the community viewed and trusted the police system for years to come. When Clarice entered the meeting room, all eyes turned to her. Some looked anxious, while others maintained a cold demeanor. But Clarice paid no attention to the reactions. She placed the stack of documents on the table, took a deep breath, and began her presentation. Her voice was steady but carried weight, with each statement grounded in data and truth. Throughout this investigation, we have uncovered not only individual acts of misconduct, but also deeper systemic issues, Clarice said, her gaze sweeping across the room. Our current oversight processes have been insufficient in preventing abuse of power. The communities we serve have lost faith in this department, and that is a serious failure we cannot ignore. She proceeded to outline her reform proposals, which included establishing an independent oversight committee, enhancing training programs to emphasize ethical values and accountability, and improving the process for addressing community complaints. Some in the room quietly nodded in agreement, while others remained reserved. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, who had previously opposed her publicly, stayed silent, but his gaze no longer carried the defiance it once had. When Clarice finished her presentation, a silence hung over the room. Chief Collins leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. "Clarice, what you've presented is detailed and compelling. But I need you to understand that these changes won't come easily. There will be significant resistance from both within and outside the department." Clarice nodded, responding calmly yet firmly. "I understand, sir. But if we don't start now, we will continue to lose the trust of the community. And when that happens, the entire system will collapse." Collins studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "I agree with you. We'll move forward with the changes you've proposed. But you must be prepared to face the challenges ahead." Clarice left the meeting feeling both relieved and resolute. She knew this was just the beginning, but gaining the leadership's approval was a crucial step forward. When she returned to the office, her team greeted her with hopeful smiles. Clarice looked at them, sensing the strength of their collective spirit, and thanked them for believing in her and supporting her on this journey. In the following weeks, the proposed reforms began to take shape. Community meetings were held more frequently, where Clarice and her team listened to concerns, shared their plans, and worked to rebuild trust. She met again with Marjorie Williams, the woman who had shared her son's story. This time, Marjorie came not to file a complaint, but to express her gratitude. "Thank you, Clarice. You've made me believe that someone is truly listening to us," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Clarice smiled, her heart filled with warmth, but she knew her work was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, from internal pushback to external pressures. Yet, she remained steadfast in her conviction that what she was doing was right. One evening, as Clarice spent time with her family at home, her young daughter Sarah approached her and asked, "Mom, why do you have to work so much?" Clarice looked at her daughter with gentle yet determined eyes. "Because I want you to grow up in a fairer world," she replied. Those words were not only meant for her daughter, but also served as a reminder to herself of why she had started this journey. Despite the difficulties ahead, Clarice knew that every step she took contributed to meaningful change, no matter how small. With that belief, Clarice continued her work, not just as the Director of Internal Affairs, but also as a mother, a community advocate, and a relentless fighter for justice. She understood that true change didn't come from easy steps, but from brave decisions and tireless efforts. They laughed at him, like a security guard mocked him all day long until the day he became their boss, and handed them the dismissal papers. Marcus Reed had been working the night shift at Crestwood Financial for 10 years. He knew every hallway, every back entrance, every executive who barely glanced at him as they walked past. His job wasn't complicated. Scan key cards, monitor security cameras, make sure no one who wasn't supposed to be there got in. He was good at it. The pay was decent, the benefits steady. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. Most people didn't see him at all. He was just another uniform, another name tag, another face that blended into the background of a place filled with power. And that was fine. He was used to it. Until he wasn't. Ethan Caldwell was one of Crestwood's senior partners, a man who had never once had to struggle for anything. He came from old money, went to the kind of schools where last names mattered more than intelligence, and walked through the world like it belonged to him. He wasn't just rich, he was arrogant, and he liked to make sure people knew it, especially people like Marcus. At first, it was just small things, a smirk, a dismissive glance, a passing comment, said just loud enough for Marcus to hear, but never direct enough to be called out. But then, one night, it wasn't small anymore. Marcus was stationed near the executive lounge, a sleek private space on the top floor where the firm's biggest clients and highest-ranking executives gathered. He wasn't allowed inside, of course, but he could hear them. The low hum of conversation, the clinking of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. Then Ethan's voice cut through. "Can you imagine if the security guy ran this place?" Laughter followed. Marcus didn't move. He didn't react. But then another voice, female, amused, added, "Please." He probably struggles to balance his own checkbook. More laughter. Marcus kept his face neutral, his posture steady. He had learned a long time ago that reacting only made it worse. But something about this moment stuck with him. It wasn't just what they said. It was how they said it. So certain, so absolute, like the idea of someone like him having power was ridiculous. He finished his shift, went home, sat in his car in the driveway for a long time before going inside. He gripped the steering wheel, staring out at the quiet street, and thought about every time he had told himself that it didn't matter, that as long as he worked hard, as long as he did his job, nothing else should bother him. But that logic wasn't holding up anymore. He needed to talk to someone. He grabbed his phone and called his older brother, Malcolm. "Yo, you good?" Malcolm answered after 2 rings. Marcus hesitated. "Yeah, just had one of those days." Malcolm chuckled. "Let me guess. Some rich folks made you feel like you weren't supposed to be in their space." Marcus exhaled. "Something like that." "Well, that ain't new." "It's not," Marcus admitted. "But today was different." Malcolm didn't say anything right away. He waited. He always did. "They laughed," Marcus finally said. "Like, outright laughed at the idea of me being anything more than a security guard." Malcolm was quiet for a long moment. Then, when he finally spoke, it wasn't what Marcus expected. "Good." Marcus frowned. "Good?" "Yeah. Means you're finally tired of it." Marcus leaned his head back against the seat, staring up at the roof of his car. "What am I supposed to do? Quit my job because a couple of rich assholes don't respect me?" "Nah," Malcolm said. "But you're smarter than that. Smarter than them, too." Marcus let those words settle. He had always been good with numbers, always had a mind for strategy. When he was 16, he turned a couple $100 into a few thousand by flipping sneakers. Later, he got into stocks, real estate, investing in small businesses. He understood how money moved. He had built something for himself quietly, while people like Ethan assumed he was just another uniform. But he had never gone all in. "Remember what Dad used to say?" Malcolm continued. "When people only see you one way, you got 2 choices. Prove them right or prove them wrong." Marcus exhaled. "Yeah, I remember." "Then what you gonna do?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He was thinking about Crestwood Financial, the sleek glass offices, the overpriced coffee, the way people like Ethan never even considered that someone like him could be their equal. They saw him as small. And maybe up until now, he had been thinking small. He looked at his hands, rough from years of work. Then, at the dashboard where his security report clipboard sat. This wasn't all he was. He knew that. But they didn't. And that needed to change. Because proving them wrong wasn't going to happen overnight. But it was going to happen. He thought back to every late night he spent reading finance books in the break room, every investment article he had saved on his phone, every bit of business knowledge he had picked up by listening in on the executives at Crestwood who spoke freely in front of him, assuming he wasn't paying attention. But he was. He had been for years. They never noticed that Marcus read the financial reports they left open on their desks while making his security rounds. They never noticed how he studied the stock prices flashing on their screens as he walked past their offices. They never noticed that he understood every number, every chart, every deal they bragged about over drinks. He knew how the game was played. He had just never had the opportunity to play it himself. Until now. That night, instead of going to sleep, Marcus stayed up researching. He opened his laptop and started digging into Crestwood's financials. He already knew the company had been struggling, but when he looked deeper, he saw just how bad it really was. Client retention was dropping. Major investors were pulling out. Expenses were skyrocketing while revenue was stagnating. The numbers didn't lie. Crestwood was in trouble, and Ethan, the man who had mocked him, was one of the reasons why. Ethan had been making risky deals, overpromising and under-delivering, relying on his family name and old connections instead of real business acumen. He was bleeding the company dry, and no one was stopping him. But Marcus could. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the numbers on his screen. and felt something shift inside him. He had always been on the outside looking in, but what if just this once he stepped inside? What if he didn't just watch the game being played? What if he made his own moves? Because Crestwood wasn't untouchable, and neither was Ethan. They had no idea that the man they had dismissed, the man they had laughed at, the man they had overlooked for years, was about to become their biggest problem. Because Marcus had a plan, and he wasn't going to stop until he saw it through. Marcus spent the next few months planning, moving in silence, making sure every step was calculated. He wasn't impulsive, never had been. He knew this wasn't something he could rush. The people at Crestwood Financial, the ones who walked past him like he was a piece of furniture, the ones who mocked him without a second thought, they would never see him coming. He didn't need them to. He needed them to keep underestimating him, to keep assuming he was just a uniform, just a night shift security guard, just another invisible man in a world where power belonged to people like Ethan Caldwell. Because while they were sipping cocktails in penthouse lounges, laughing about market trends and hedge fund collapses, Marcus was building something real. He had started small, flipping sneakers in high school, learning how to buy low and sell high, understanding supply and demand before he even knew what those terms meant. Then he moved on to cars, figuring out how to negotiate, how to spot a deal before anyone else did. When he got older, he studied stocks, real estate, small business investments, anything that would teach him how to make money work for him instead of the other way around. He had turned a few thousand into a few 100,000, then into millions. And he did it quietly. No flashy purchases, no unnecessary risks. Just smart moves, one after the other. And now, he was ready for his biggest move yet. Crestwood Financial was failing. It looked successful on the surface, with its glass-walled offices and designer suits. But the numbers told a different story. Marcus had been watching, studying every detail, listening when they thought he wasn't. He knew which accounts were struggling, which clients were getting ready to pull out, which executives were making bad calls. And he knew that Ethan Caldwell was a liability. Ethan had been reckless, arrogant, making deals that looked good in board meetings but were sinking the company from the inside out. He was burning through money relying on reputation instead of results, too blind to see that the empire he thought he controlled was crumbling beneath him. Marcus didn't need to destroy Crestwood. It was already falling apart. He just needed to be there to catch the pieces. He had already started making moves, connecting with the right people, securing meetings with investors who actually knew what they were doing, men who cared about numbers more than family names, men who saw potential instead of pedigrees. They listened to him, not because of where he came from, not because of his job title, but because he understood the game better than most of the men running it. And that was all that mattered. The first step was securing shares. Crestwood wasn't a publicly traded company, but it had multiple stakeholders, former executives, private investors, people who had put money in years ago and were now desperate to get out before the whole thing collapsed. Marcus approached them one by one, offering deals they couldn't refuse. Some hesitated at first. A security guard buying into a major investment firm? It sounded ridiculous. Until they saw the numbers. Until they realized he wasn't just some guy with a dream. He was a businessman. He was a strategist. He was their best option. And so, one by one, they signed. It took weeks of careful negotiations, late-night meetings, long phone calls with his legal team, but by the time the paperwork was finalized, Marcus held the controlling interest in Crestwood Financial. He owned the company. And no one at Crestwood had a clue. The next step was execution. He waited until the perfect moment, until the board meeting where Ethan was supposed to present his latest financial strategy, a plan that Marcus already knew was doomed to fail. He let Ethan walk into that conference room, Let him sit at the head of the table, let him open his mouth and start talking about profit margins and projected growth, while everyone around him nodded like they believed him. And then, Marcus walked in. The room went silent. Executives exchanged confused glances, assistants whispered to each other, no one understanding why the night shift security guard was standing in the middle of their meeting. But Ethan just laughed. A short, amused chuckle, shaking his head like this was some kind of joke. "Marcus," he said, smirking, "I think you're in the wrong room." Marcus didn't smile. He pulled out a thick folder, set it on the table, and slid it toward Ethan. "Actually," he said, voice calm, steady, controlled, "I think you are." Ethan frowned, his smirk faltering as he reached for the folder, flipping it open. Silence stretched as he read. The room was so quiet that Marcus could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of someone typing outside the glass walls. Ethan's face paled. He flipped another page, then another, his fingers tightening around the paper. "This is a joke," Ethan muttered. "This isn't real." "It's real," Marcus said simply. "As of this morning, I own the majority of Crestwood Financial." Ethan looked up, eyes sharp, mouth opening to argue, to deny it, to call it impossible. But the numbers didn't lie. The contracts were signed. The deal was done. He wasn't in charge anymore. Marcus was. Panic flickered across Ethan's face before he forced it down, leaning back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest like this was just another business deal, like he wasn't watching his entire world shift beneath him. "What do you want?" he asked, voice tight. Marcus tilted his head slightly. "What do I want?" he repeated, like he was considering the question. Then, he leaned forward, placing his hands on the table, looking Ethan dead in the eye. "I want you out." A sharp intake of breath from someone in the room. A few executives glanced at each other, shifting in their seats, but no one spoke. No one defended Ethan, no one argued, because they knew. They had seen the reports, had watched the numbers decline, had listened to Ethan's bad decisions pile up. They knew this had been coming. They just hadn't expected Marcus to be the one delivering the final blow. Ethan let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can just walk in here and fire me?" "I don't think," Marcus said. "I know." He pushed another document across the table, this one already signed, already finalized. "Your termination papers. Effective immediately." Ethan's jaw clenched. He stared at the papers, at the name printed at the top, at the reality settling in. He had lost. Marcus straightened, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, glancing around the room. "For those of you still here," he said, voice calm, controlled, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Things are about to change." He let the words settle, let the reality sink in. Crestwood Financial isn't the same company it was yesterday, and it sure as hell isn't the company it was when I was standing outside that door every night. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, finally, Marcus turned back to Ethan, giving him a small, almost amused smile. "Don't worry," he said. "I'm sure there's a security job out there for you somewhere." Ethan's face turned red, his hands balling into fists, but he said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. The office would never be the same again. And for the first time in 10 years, Marcus wasn't standing outside looking in. He was in charge. The room stayed silent as Marcus watched Ethan struggle to process what had just happened. The other executives sat frozen, shifting in their seats, unsure if they should say something or wait for their new boss to speak. Marcus didn't rush. He let the weight of the moment settle, let the realization sink in for everyone. He had spent years being the man no one noticed, the one they walked past without a second glance, the one they assumed was just there to keep them safe but never to be their equal. And now, here he was, standing at the head of the table, holding the future of Crestwood Financial in his hands. Ethan still hadn't moved. His face was flushed, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He glanced at the document in front of him again, as if hoping that staring at it long enough would change what it said. "This isn't over," he finally muttered under his breath, but even he didn't sound convinced. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "It is for you." Ethan pushed back his chair suddenly, the sound echoing through the silent room. He grabbed the termination letter and stuffed it into his briefcase like he could shove away the reality of it all. Then shot Marcus a look filled with barely contained rage. But there was nothing he could do. The deal was signed, the power had shifted, and he had no choice but to stand up, straighten his overpriced suit, and storm out of the conference room without another word. The glass door swung shut behind him, and just like that, Ethan Caldwell, the man who had once ruled Crestwood Financial, was gone. Marcus let out a slow breath, scanning the faces around the table. Some were nervous, some curious, a few still in shock. He didn't blame them. It wasn't every day that the man they had ignored for a decade walked in and took control. He took a step forward, resting his hands on the back of Ethan's now vacant chair, and finally spoke. "For those of you still here," he said, voice steady, "things are going to change." A few people exchanged glances. Some sat up straighter. One or two seemed like they were already calculating their exit strategy. That was fine. He didn't need everyone to stay. He just needed the right people. "Crestwood Financial has been bleeding money for months," he continued. "Bad leadership, outdated strategies, wasted resources. Some of you know that already. Some of you have been waiting for someone to step up and fix it." He let his eyes move across the room, reading the expressions, watching how people reacted. "I'm here to do exactly that, but I'm not here to keep things the way they were. If you're here just to collect a paycheck and coast along like nothing's changed, I suggest you follow Ethan out that door." No one moved. No one spoke. "Good." He leaned forward slightly. "I've already reviewed the numbers. I know who's been pulling their weight and who's been dead weight. There will be cuts. But for those of you who are ready to work, to actually build something better than what we've had, there's a place for you here." He reached into his folder and pulled out a thick stack of reports, placing them on the table. "I've already put together a restructuring plan. The details will be sent out by the end of the day. If you have questions, you know where to find me." Then he straightened, meeting their eyes once more. "That's all." Slowly, the executives started to rise, some still hesitant, others nodding, understanding that their world had just changed whether they liked it or not. A few came up to him, shaking his hand, offering quiet words of congratulations or pledging their support. He accepted their handshakes, their words, but he didn't waste time with pleasantries. There was too much work to do. By the time the last person had left the room, Marcus let out a slow breath and glanced around. The air in the room felt different. The weight of years of dismissal, of being overlooked, had lifted, and in its place was something new. Authority. Control. He turned and walked out, heading toward what was now his office. Ethan's old corner suite, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. He had stood outside those windows for years, patrolling hallways, watching as men like Ethan sat behind desks, making decisions, running things. Now this space belonged to him. When he stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was how ridiculously large the office was. It wasn't just an office. It was a statement. Leather chairs, a massive mahogany desk, shelves lined with expensive books that Ethan had probably never read. The view stretched over Manhattan, the skyline glowing under the afternoon sun. Marcus walked to the window, resting his hands in his pockets, looking out at the city below. It felt surreal. He had spent so long grinding, working in the background, learning, waiting for his moment. And now here he was, standing exactly where they had never imagined he would be. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Ellen, Ethan's former assistant, standing hesitantly in the doorway. She had been at Crestwood for over 20 years, long enough to see every CEO come and go. "Everything all right?" she asked. Marcus nodded. "Just getting used to the view." She gave a small smile. "I imagine it looks a lot different from this side." He studied her for a moment. She wasn't like the others. She had been around long enough to see the rise and fall, to understand the inner workings of the company better than most of the men who had run it. "I have a question for you," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "All right. Why are you still here?" Ellen folded her arms, considering. "Because I love what this place used to be, and I think under the right leadership it could be that again." Marcus nodded slowly. "Ethan didn't deserve this company," she added after a moment. "Everyone knew it. They just didn't say it out loud." "And now?" Marcus asked. She studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Now I think you might be exactly what this place needs." Marcus smirked, then turned back to the window. "Let's get to work." Change was coming. Not just for Crestwood Financial, not just for the employees still trying to wrap their heads around what had happened, but for Marcus himself. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't just proving himself. He was leading. And this was only the beginning. He thought she was just another citizen he could bully into submissio until she walked into the courtroom and destroyed his career. The Texas night stretched dark and quiet over Highway 183, just outside Austin. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of sun-baked asphalt still lingering despite the cooler evening breeze. Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, wasn't thinking about her past legal battles or the political arenas she had once dominated. She was just trying to get home. Her silver Chevy Tahoe cruised steadily down the empty stretch of highway. It had been a long evening at a charity event in downtown Austin, a rare occasion where she could step out of the political sphere and simply be herself. She wasn't dressed in a power suit, no entourage, no press, just a woman driving home. She had ditched the heels for a pair of comfortable flats, her blonde hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, a navy blazer draped over her shoulders. Then, in her rearview mirror, she saw them, flashing red and blue lights. Her fingers instinctively tightened on the wheel. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a light. There was no reason for this stop. But she knew how these things went. She had argued countless cases involving unlawful stops, racial profiling, and abuse of power. Her mind flicked through legal precedents and courtroom memories as she signaled, carefully changing lanes before pulling to the side. The patrol car pulled up close, almost aggressively, its headlights flooding her Tahoe's interior. She turned off the engine, took a deep breath, and kept her hands visible on the steering wheel. She had been in high-stakes depositions, tense negotiations, political interrogations, but something about this moment was different. A long pause. The officer took his time stepping out of the vehicle, dragging out the moment like a performance meant to establish dominance. His boots scuffed loudly against the pavement as he approached. His stance was deliberate, calculated, the swagger of a man who never expected to be questioned. His nameplate caught the glow of her taillights, Sergeant Mark Givens. Pam had never heard of him, but she already knew his type. "License and registration," he barked. No greeting, no explanation. Pam turned her head slightly, catching his reflection in the side mirror. He was staring at her like a hunter sizing up prey. She moved slowly, keeping her voice calm. "Was I speeding, officer?" Givens didn't answer immediately. Instead, he snatched the documents from her hand and held them just out of reach, pretending to examine them while eyeing her up and down, his expression unreadable. Taillights out. Pam frowned. That wasn't right. Her Tahoe had been serviced just last week. She had checked the lights herself before heading to the event. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice level but firm. Givens tilted his head, his lips curling slightly, as if amused by her nerve. "Are you arguing with me?" Pam's jaw tightened. She had seen this power play before, in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in police reports filed by terrified civilians who had been bullied into silence. A beat of silence stretched between them. She knew better than to push. But she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied carefully. "My taillights were checked last week. But if there's an issue, I can get it fixed." Givens took a slow step closer, his shadow stretching across her driver's side door. "Step out of the car." Pam's heart kicked up a notch. Her instincts screamed that this was about more than a broken taillight. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, keeping her tone measured. Givens smirked. "Because I said so." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken authority. Pam exhaled slowly. She knew what this was, a test, a game, a trap. She glanced at the empty road ahead. No witnesses, no cameras. Damn. Her mind raced. She could comply, step out, let him play his little game, fight this later in court. Or she could push back, challenge him here and now, and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With deliberate movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt, opened the door, and stepped onto the pavement. The air was thick with tension. Givens took a step back, scanning her, deciding how far he could push this. "Turn around, hands on the car." Pam hesitated. For what reason? Givens narrowed his eyes. "Are you resisting?" There it was again. That unspoken rule. Don't question authority. Don't make this harder for yourself. Pam stood her ground. "I'm asking a question." A flicker of something crossed his face. Annoyance? Amusement? Maybe both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered, his tone sharp, clipped, performative. Pam's pulse picked up, but she didn't break eye contact. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." Givens didn't like that. His jaw tensed. "You're under arrest." Pam barely had time to react before he grabbed her wrist. She moved just enough to avoid his grip. Under arrest for what? Givens didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his cuffs. Obstructing an officer. Pam exhaled sharply through her nose, so that was his game. Her legal training kicked in, heartbeat steady, breathing controlled. She knew she had two choices. She turned slowly, placing her hands on the roof of her Tahoe. The metal was cool beneath her palms. Givens wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back, tightening the cuffs far too much. Pam's wrists burned. "You don't know who you're messing with," she murmured. Givens chuckled, shoving her toward the patrol car. "Lady, I don't care who you are." That was his biggest mistake. Pam barely flinched as Sergeant Mark Givens shoved her toward the patrol car, her wrists burning against the metal cuffs. The hard plastic seat pressed into her back as the door slammed shut behind her. She let out a slow, measured breath, her pulse steady despite the fire simmering beneath her skin. She had faced power-hungry men before. Judges, prosecutors, politicians who thought they were invincible. But something about Givens was different. He wasn't playing by any rules. He was the kind of officer who had learned he could get away with things simply because no one had ever stopped him. She watched through the cage-like partition as he strutted back to his vehicle, radioing in something she couldn't quite make out. His tone smug, his posture relaxed, like a man who had already won. The patrol car jerked forward, the overhead lights still flashing, painting the road in alternating red and blue. Pam kept her gaze on Given's reflection in the rearview mirror. He didn't acknowledge her, just drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, whistling like this was any other night. "You know," he said after a moment, eyes still on the road, "most people just keep their mouth shut when I tell them to step out." Pam exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Givens let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She didn't break eye contact in the mirror. "I don't think. I know." His fingers flexed around the wheel, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug exterior, but he masked it quickly. "Military?" he asked, his tone shifting as if trying to size her up again. She didn't answer. "Yeah, I figured. Got that attitude, that above-the-law type." He smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, she stayed silent. Givens clicked his tongue. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Her jaw tightened. The audacity of it, as if this was somehow her fault. The station came into view, a squat gray building just off the main road, fluorescent lights flickering against the near-empty parking lot. Late-night processing was slow. For now, it looked like she was the only guest. Givens pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, his smirk widening, "I love when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he ordered. Pam twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out, feeling the cuffs dig deeper into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past the bored-looking desk sergeant, into the booking area. The air was thick with the stale scent of burnt coffee and disinfectant. A metal bench lined the far wall, a steel door leading to the cells just beyond it. Givens uncuffed her just long enough to push her through the booking process. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, just going through the motions, their eyes glazed with indifference. She had seen this kind of apathy before. It was the kind that let men like Givens thrive. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, tighter this time, leading her toward the holding cells. You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath. She glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that got under his skin. "Enjoy your stay," Givens sneered, shoving her toward the open cell. Pam caught herself before she stumbled, turning just in time to see the metal bars slide shut between them. Givens smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. She took a slow breath, then sank onto the cold, hard bench. The walls pressed in, but she had been in tighter situations before. This wasn't about the cell. This was about control. He wanted her to feel small. He wanted her to regret standing her ground. He wanted her to break. But she wouldn't. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmur of officers talking at the front desk, the occasional shuffle of paperwork, the distant clatter of a coffee cup against a table. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. Control the breathing. Control the mind. Then, footsteps. Heavy. Confident. She knew it was Givens before he even came into view. His stride had that same arrogant rhythm. He appeared in front of the cell, arms crossed, the smirk still firmly in place. "Comfy?" She didn't answer. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. "You know?" he continued, his voice dropping just slightly. "If you just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." Pam let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." For the first time, Givens's smirk faltered. A flicker of something, annoyance, uncertainty, crossed his face before he covered it up fast, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady?" He shrugged. "Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." She just watched him, unmoved, unshaken. Givens leaned in slightly. "See, here's the thing," he continued, lowering his voice further. "People like you think the rules don't apply. Think a little confidence is enough to get out of trouble." Pam let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter, because he didn't know what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached from the hallway. Younger, probably in his late 20s, dressed in a standard issue uniform. He stopped a few feet away, clipboard in hand, shifting slightly on his feet. Sergeant?" Givens barely glanced at him. The younger officer hesitated. "We got a call." Givens frowned. "And?" The younger officer cleared his throat. "I think you need to see this." Pam sat back, listening. The conversation was hushed, but she caught pieces. Something about a lawyer, a call from higher up, questions about why she was being held. Givens' voice dropped lower, sharper, annoyed. The younger officer stammered something in response, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to make Givens happy. Then, heavy footsteps. Givens stormed back, jaw tight, fists clenched at his sides. His smirk was gone. "What the hell did you do?" he snapped. Pam leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "I didn't do anything." She tilted her head slightly. "But people talk. And some of us have friends in very high places." Givens' face darkened. She could see it now. The realization creeping in. The shift in power. He wasn't in control anymore. He turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath, disappearing down the hallway. Pam exhaled. It wouldn't be long now. And when the truth came out, Mark Givens was going to regret every single decision that led him here. Pam remained seated on the cold metal bench, her hands resting on her knees, her posture unwavering. The distant murmur of voices beyond the cell door carried a tension that was slowly building. A storm about to break. She knew how this worked. A call from higher up meant Givens was no longer in control of the situation, and for men like him, that was the worst thing that could happen. Power was only satisfying when it was unchecked, when there were no consequences. Now he was realizing that his authority had limits. She listened, catching pieces of his hushed argument with the younger officer. "What do you mean, a lawyer?" Givens' voice was sharp, clipped with frustration. The younger officer hesitated, but his tone remained firm. "She's got a legal team, a big one. Calls are coming in. You might want to take this seriously." Givens cursed under his breath. Pam smirked to herself, though she kept her expression neutral when she heard his heavy boots storming back toward her. He appeared in front of the cell, hands clenched at his sides, his face flushed with anger. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded. She leaned back slightly, tilting her head, the image of calm in the face of his growing panic. "I didn't do anything," she said evenly. "But I did tell you that you didn't know who you were messing with." The muscle in his jaw twitched. He wanted to snap back, wanted to reclaim the power he had lost, but he was beginning to understand that it was slipping away faster than he could grasp it. A voice from the hallway interrupted them. "Sergeant Givens." It was another officer, this one older, his voice carrying a weight of authority that even Givens couldn't ignore. "Step into my office, now." Givens hesitated, his eyes darting to Pam for just a second, as if weighing his options. But he had none left. Without another word, he turned sharply on his heel and disappeared into the hallway. Pam let out a slow, measured breath. But she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Minutes passed. Then more. The air in the holding area felt charged, as if everyone could sense something shifting. When Givens finally returned, he wasn't alone. A second officer trailed behind him, and his expression had changed, his usual smug confidence replaced by something colder, more defensive. He walked up to the cell, but this time, he didn't speak right away. He stared at her, as if trying to will her into submission one last time. Then, begrudgingly, he pulled out his keys and unlocked the cell door. The clang of the metal echoed through the room. "You're free to go," he muttered, his voice tight, filled with restrained rage. Pam didn't move right away. She studied him, searching for any sign of remorse. But there was none. He wasn't sorry for what he had done. He was just angry that he couldn't get away with it this time. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her steps steady, controlled. The younger officer from earlier was waiting just outside the door. He handed her a clipboard with a pen. "Sign here, Ms. Bondi." She took it, signed her name with deliberate precision, and handed it back. "Your belongings," he added, pushing a small plastic tray toward her. "Her phone, her purse, her keys." She picked up her phone first, quickly unlocking it, scanning the notifications. Calls, messages, news alerts. This had already gone public. She turned toward Givens, who was watching her with barely contained fury. "This isn't over," he hissed under his breath. Pam smiled, slow and confident. "Oh, I know," she said. "But not for me." She walked past him, her steps light despite the weight of the past few hours. The air outside was cool, fresh, a stark contrast to the heavy staleness of the station. She took a deep breath before heading toward the black SUV idling by the curb. Her lawyer, David Whitmore, was already waiting. The door open, his sharp gaze scanning her carefully as she approached. "You okay?" he asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Pam nodded, sliding into the passenger seat. "I've been through worse." David exhaled, shaking his head as he pulled away from the curb. "This guy's done," he said. "The footage from his body cam is already being reviewed. It's bad." Pam glanced out the window, the city lights flashing by. "How bad?" David smirked, his lawyer instincts kicking in. "Let's just say internal affairs won't have to dig too deep. This wasn't his first time pulling something like this. He's got a record of excessive force complaints, racial profiling, even a few cases that mysteriously disappeared before making it to trial." Pam's grip tightened on her phone. "And no one stopped him?" David sighed. "Welcome to the system." She shook her head, her jaw clenching. She knew how this worked. She had fought against it her entire career. But now it was personal. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. "Former Attorney General wrongfully detained, officer under investigation." News anchors dissected the footage, legal analysts debated the implications, and the public, furious engaged, demanded answers. Pam sat in her apartment, sipping her coffee as she watched it unfold. Calls flooded in, reporters, colleagues, even old political allies she hadn't spoken to in years. But it was one call in particular that made her pause. "Pam." She recognized the voice immediately. The governor. "I assume you've seen the news?" he asked. She leaned back against the couch. "Hard to miss." A brief silence. "How are you feeling?" Pam glanced at her reflection in the window. She looked the same. No cracks, no signs of defeat. "Like I did exactly what I was supposed to do. The governor sighed. That's what I thought you'd say. Another pause, then more carefully. The Department of Justice is taking an interest in this case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it. Pam exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure she wanted to become the face of another legal battle, but she also knew she couldn't just walk away. I'm not looking to be a headline, she said. You already are. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words settle. Givens wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her. It was about the dozens, maybe even hundreds of people who had been in her shoes, but didn't have the rank, the legal team, or the voice to fight back. Across town, in the police department, Sergeant Givens sat in a private office, staring at the internal affairs officer sitting across from him. A thick file sat on the desk between them, his file, the one he never thought anyone would open. The investigator flipped through the pages slowly, methodically. Then, he looked up. You've got a problem, Sergeant. Givens clenched his fists. This is bull... The investigator held up a hand. Don't finish that sentence. His voice was cold, sharp, final. Pack up your desk. Effective immediately. You're on unpaid leave. And if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. For the first time in his career, Mark Givens realized he wasn't untouchable. Meanwhile, Pam stepped out onto the sidewalk, the weight of the past 24 hours settling onto her shoulders, but she didn't let it drag her down. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. He was laughing about something, carefree, full of life. She watched them for a moment. This fight had never been just about her. She took a deep breath, then walked forward, her steps firm, her purpose clear. The system had failed too many people for too long. But today was a win.